I'm Soledad O'Brien. Welcome to Matter of Fact. When President Trump took the oath of office on January 20th, 2017, he promised to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. The wording of the oath is specified in Article 2 of the Constitution, which also outlines the powers of the executive branch, what the president can do and can't do. Since Trump took that oath, his presidency has been mired in constitutional controversies, including his executive orders on immigration, whether his foreign business holdings violate the Emoluments Clause, and issues surrounding special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 election. So, is the president violating the Constitution or testing the limits of presidential power? Corey Brettschneider is a professor of political science at Brown University. He's also the author of a new book. It's called The Oath and the Office, a guide to the Constitution for future presidents. It's so nice to have you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Why did you feel like you needed to write a guide to the Constitution? Anything happening right now with the current president so you felt could learn something from this book?
Yes. The book is directed in part to future presidents, but it's also about the current situation. And I originally was writing a book called Trump versus the Constitution, which was a sort of more direct way to deal with many of the issues coming up now. But the idea was really we need to think about the basics, not just for the moment that we're in right now, but for the future. And thinking about the oath of office in particular was a way to do that. I mean, it's a ritual, but the president says that the president commits in the oath to protect, preserve, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Some people would say President Trump is not trying to attack the Constitution. He's just testing the limits of the Constitution. Do they have a point?
Well, I would say it's a stress test on the Constitution, and that, again, there isn't anything that guarantees that these rights will remain. But no, I think he's really gone beyond any previous president in many of the statements that he's made and in many of the proposals.
Like what, for example?
So if you think during the campaign, threatening a shutdown, a complete shutdown of Muslim immigration into the country, that's not an implicit use of prejudice against Muslim Americans. It's about the most explicit use of racism that you could get, or of anti-Islamic sentiment. Now, our Constitution guarantees free exercise of religion, requirement that the government not establish a religion. I think those statements, the explicit version of the first ban, were about the most clear violation of the Constitution that you could get.
We've talked about the Emoluments Clause probably 3 or 4 times on this show, which is more times than I've ever talked about the Emoluments Clause that I didn't even know existed, prior to 2 years ago. Do you think that the president is in fact violating the Emoluments Clause, clearly?
I do. What it says is that a president can't use the office for personal profit. And by refusing to put his assets in a blind trust, as every recent president has done, and by hyping up his businesses in all sorts of ways, that's exactly what the framers worried about. The idea of the office is supposed to be a public trust that one acts as president in the interests of the public good.
Did the framers of the Constitution consider all of this all those many years ago?
I think so. They talked about a demagogue who might be the opposite of a deliberative president. And yes, I think they predicted it, and they tried to put checks in place of how to deal with a president like this.
Now you're getting into the part of the Constitution that I do remember from 7th grade. It's all very fuzzy, but I do remember some parts, right? And that was the other parts, the checks and balances. So you have Congress and you have the courts. Have they, I mean, is it more than just the failures of a president and that office? Is it a failure of Congress and the courts, too?
I think so. I think that in that Muslim ban case that we talked about, the court split 4-4 with Justice Kennedy giving a very ambiguous opinion and ultimately siding with the majority and not striking down the Muslim ban. I think that was a failure. You know, one of the most interesting things in this book that I thought was, and there's a lot that's really fascinating, is about President Nixon. And just the way in which he also felt that he was above the law. Clearly. He said that. He said something to the effect of, when a president does it, it's not illegal. And people are having those same conversations today. I mean, I think we read that and think, well, that sounds crazy. But there are many people who say you can't indict a sitting president, that when the president does something because he's the president, it's not illegal. One of the great moments in American history is when the Supreme Court said to Richard Nixon that he had to answer a subpoena for information in a criminal case, and that he wasn't above the law. And that was a unanimous opinion, 8-0. And that was one of the shining lights, I think, in our history that we should turn to. The framers disagreed about whether you could indict a sitting president. Hamilton thought you had to wait until after the president had left office. James Wilson thought you could do it. And I think a simple principle decides that controversy. And the principle is that when a president does it, it can be illegal, the opposite of what Richard Nixon said.
The book is called The Oath and the Office. Corey Brechnard, so nice to have you.
Thank you. Real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure's ours. Thanks.